Trustee training.
Hello, I'm Eddie Finch, and I'll be talking about risk and reserves policies and management for charities. So risks and reserves are a pair of policies that are both really sort of quasi-regulated by having to talk about them in your accounts because the SORP says you have to. They're both features of corporate governance that don't really come from any legal requirements, but as I said, are brought into what trustees feel they have to do because of the backdoor bit of regulation by making you disclose how you do them. They're very similar in process to the things that corporate entities and public sector entities might do around the same things. And we were very worried about this when these were first introduced in the 90s. They're a lot less prescriptive in the way that you have to do them than they would be in those kind of environments. For example, you don't have to write great long screeds about your control environment. They're very much connected with each other. Many risk analyses focus on reserves as being the thing that is most likely to be impacted by the events that might or might not happen. And good reserves policies, as we'll see later, are often risk-based and driven by an analysis of what the probability of different scenarios coming to be might be. They're both part of what big corporates would now do as part of their viability reporting, but also the assessment of going concern. And I'll touch on that right at the very end just to see how that all links together as part of the overall reporting. One of the best things, though, is that both of these areas are the subject of an awful lot of guidance and good practice documentation produced by the Charity Commission and lots of the sector bodies. So there's lots of places you can find out more information about both of these areas from. I'll mention some of those at the end of the session for reference. So we'll start with risk and then move on to reserves. And then at the very end, we'll come back to a reflection on how that all fits with going concern, as I said, and the sort of new ways of looking at organisational viability and sustainability as a kind of wrap up at the finish. So firstly, risk management. The requirement in the SORP is pretty simple. There's a fairly straightforward paragraph that reads that a charity should provide a description of the principal risks and uncertainties facing the charity and its subsidiary undertakings as identified by the trustees, together with a summary of their plans and strategies for managing those risks. And that sounds like a fairly straightforward report at the end of each year, but actually if we pick it apart, there's quite a lot behind what you have to do to be able to make those statements honestly. So we have to identify risks, we have to assess which risks are the principal risks to the charity. Not every single risk needs to be looked at in great detail. We have to look at the actions required to manage the risks or to deal with them if they actually crystallise. And we have to have some kind of process in place for monitoring and assessing risks over time and taking stock of the actions we've agreed to continue to manage the risks. So the first part of this is principal risks and uncertainties. And the first question that poses itself in there really is there a difference? What's the difference between risk and uncertainty? And to some extent, I think practically not much, but one way of defining risk is that it's measured uncertainty. So uncertainty in its raw form is maybe the unknown unknowns, and risk is the known unknowns that we can put some kind of evaluation around and maybe measure in some way. And then the next question we have to ask ourselves is what are the principal risks? And in order to identify the principal risk, firstly, we need to establish what the universe of risks we're choosing from is. Often because these requirements come in because of Charity SORP, everybody jumps straight to the financial answers, but the whole risk universe is a lot more than just monetary and financial. It might include risks around the governance of the organisation, so whether the trustee body is effective, whether it's got the right committees, whether delegation's properly understood, all of those kind of things. Operational risks, the delivery, the quality of what you're actually doing for your beneficiaries, whether you're doing things right. Of course, the financial risks are part and parcel of the risk assessment, and as I've already said, the adequacy of reserves and maintaining reserves at the right kind of level is a very important part of most risk assessment. And then there are all sorts of risks that really don't come from within the organisation at all. So there's risks around adverse publicity that might come from sort of inappropriate interest in the kind of things you do, targeting by outside groups, etc., or the impact of things like government policy that you can't do much about yourselves, but still have to take account of and be able to respond to. And finally, there's a very broad category of risks that come from compliance with laws, regulations, etc. And that might be the charity's own constitution that you need to be very mindful of complying with, so breach of trust effectively, or it might be the kinds of regulations around things like care homes and schools that have got very specific regulatory regimes around them. So that's the kind of general spread of risks that an organisation might have. And identifying those risks might be something that you farm out to the organisation. Individual teams might try and identify their risks, and usually you'll find that some departments will have great long lists of things that could go wrong, and others less so. But the key thing in there was to identify the principal risks. And I think that's probably something that falls back on the trustees or a specific subcommittee of the trustees. And identifying the principal risks is usually done by sort of putting them on a two-dimensional kind of assessment, looking at the likelihood of a risk occurring. And in this case, remembering that risk is not just about the things that might go wrong, but it's about the risk of failing to do the things that we wanted to, not achieving our objectives as well as we'd hoped. And also the impact of those risks on the organisation. And often, typically, that risk, the impact will be expressed financially because that's as good a shorthand as any to do it. So, for example, the scoring system might be, if we were looking at impact, a risk that's on a 1 to 5 scale. A 5 might be something that would close the organisation down completely. 3 might be something that would cause a little bit of disruption or cost, a moderate amount of harm. And 1 might be something that's just a bit irritating or wrong in principle, but isn't actually going to stop you doing anything you wanted to do in practice. And on the likelihood side, 5 might be something that's inevitable, is already happening, bound to be happening. 3 might be something that's quite probable in the medium term. And 1 would be something that's fairly remote, but is still possible. And those ones that might be scored 1 only really become relevant if their corresponding impact is at the very high end. And you can put those maybe in a sort of basket of things that are unlikely to happen, but if they did, would be very damaging. And the Charities Commission, in fact, suggests if you're using a scoring system to take account of that you bias your scoring system towards higher impact. One of the things they suggest is you multiply the two numbers together and then add the impact number on again, just so that things like complete disasters, taking your building out, have a higher weighting. Things that are very unlikely but will be completely catastrophic than something that's already happening but completely trivial, like somebody taking pencils home or whatever. They also suggest that you look at scenarios, looking at multiple risk events. And an example that's often put around there is the example of the nuclear power station in Japan, which coincided, its meltdown coincided with a tsunami, and that created all sorts of problems that were much bigger than one event on its own would have ever created. One of the key things to remember here, though, is when we're looking at assessing risks, is not to get too hung up on that kind of system of attributing numbers and whether you multiply them or add them together and that kind of thing. It's the substance of the things that might or might not happen that matters, and you really don't want to be having all-day arguments about whether something's a 4 or a 3 and that kind of thing. So now we've established what the main risks are. The next step is to evaluate the actions in place to manage or how we'll respond to the various risks that might happen. And the ways we might manage risk typically include a variety of strategies. The first thing we might do with the risk is accept the risk. Just accept that the cost of trying to manage the risk and prevent something happening is much greater than the consequence of it actually happening, or that it's a futile thing to try. So government policy, for example, that we might not actually have much influence over. And therefore we move straight into the world of what we will do if the thing happens rather than trying to stop it happening. Something else that's quite common is transferring the risk to someone else or sharing it with them. Often that's done through, say, an insurance policy or the way you structure your partnerships and contracts with other people. Something else you might do is completely eliminate a risk. So there might be some things which you consider doing which carry so much risk for the organisation that you simply choose not to do them. For example, chasing money to do something you're not really capable of doing at the expense of all the other activities of the organisation. Another strategy that I think charities aren't as good at as they could be is pricing for risk. So if you look at the way commercial organisations price their services, they'll usually include an element in the price which is to cover the risks of the things that don't go quite to plan. In a charity situation, that might be including the cost of void space, void beds in a housing charity, for example. And that kind of dealing with risk is commonplace in commercial practice. But as I say, I think because charities tend to focus on recovering costs, they don't do it as often as other organisations might. And then last on my list, just because it's first on most accountants' lists, would be internal control. So we accept that there is a bit of a risk, but we need to reduce it to an acceptable level through having appropriate internal control processes. So things like 2 people seeing every invoice, that kind of thing. So when we're looking at how we deal with risks, I mentioned before that 2 things we're looking at is firstly how we might manage risk, but secondly how we might respond to risks that do crystallise. And I hinted earlier that the kind of risks where it's most appropriate to think about what you would do if the risk did happen might be those high impact, low probability kind of things. Sometimes called black swan events, things that nobody ever conceived might happen. And the kind of things we're thinking about there when we think about how we would respond to a risk is, rather than trying to manage something and reduce how often it happens or prevent it from happening, as in the examples I've just given, is having things like business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans and things like that, which just reassure us that whilst some risks we can't manage as such, we've got a plan for what we'll do if they do happen. So having then got to the point where we've established what the risks are and prioritised them in terms of which ones are the major ones, we then need to look at how we present that information, how we make that information digestible to people. And this is where a risk register usually comes in. This is the way a lot of organisations will present it. And these will be risks characterised by either which of your objectives maybe they might disrupt, so which strategic goals are impacted by the specific risks, or the kind of origin of the risk, whether it's a governance risk or an organisational risk, for example, those kind of things. And they'll be set out in a way that shows you what the likelihood, the impact is, but also describes what the mitigation in place is, whether that is disaster recovery plans or some kind of management of the risk. And then a step that a lot of organisations take is to go one step further than that and distinguish between gross risk and net risk. So gross risk is the risk that's there without any action being taken to manage it, just how the risk, if you like, exists in the wild. And net risk is what we perceive the remaining risk is after any action we're taking to manage it. And then if we look at an example risk register, we can see that we've got headings for those things, for the description, the likelihood, impact. We get to a gross risk. We look at what the controls are and assess how effective the controls are, and then we can assess what the net risk is. I'm just looking at a couple of examples. One example might be the principal funding agreement of an organisation. There's a risk that the funder might not renew the funding, and if that was a high proportion, say 80% of our work that was funded by that agreement, that would be an absolutely phenomenal impact on our organisation. It would be a potential close down scenario. We believe that maintaining open dialogue with the funder is actually something that helps us understand how likely that risk is to happen in the shorter term and manage it to a certain extent. And we've also got reserves to cover the cost of winding down. So that would mean that after considering our mitigating actions, we might decide that the risk has gone from being a 5 risk, a sort of closing down type of risk, to a risk that is less severe because we could adjust and cope. Another example we might look at is if we're an organisation that lends money to people who find it difficult to borrow in the ordinary market, we might be looking at a situation where we'd expect to incur bad debt expenses, to have defaults from lending to people who'd got no sort of way of showing that they were responsible with money, no credit history maybe. And the response we might have to that is to not advance money to people who don't have a credit history. However, if trustees have a constructive discussion about both of those risks, they might come to very slightly different decisions or different conclusions. The initial conclusion might have been that the reserves aren't big enough to actually cover the costs of closing down very well, and that dialogue isn't very effective at actually changing the likelihood that the council may or may not renew the funding. And therefore the trustees would need to think a little differently. And in that case, the response might be, it's a risk that we can't necessarily control or manage the likelihood of, so we'd be more likely to have a detailed plan for what to do if we know that the funding's likely to end. So curtailing contracts and going into maybe a cost reduction scenario at a particular point in time. The second risk, though, illustrated a different point, which we think is quite important, that trustees don't very often consider the social impact side of impact when they're considering the impact of risks. So in that example, the charity was considering whether to lend money to people without credit scores, and it came to the decision, don't lend money to people with no credit history. And actually, if the objective of the charity is to try and increase access of finance to people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to get it in the market, they should really be thinking that not lending to people because of no credit history is actually flying in the face of their objectives. And then their answer would be, well, actually, if we haven't got a credit score, is there something else we could look at to find a way of lending to these people? So rather than a credit score being the only example of credit worthiness, we might look at something like whether they've got a good history of rent repayment, for example. So the second example register shows a different response, having used the impact on our beneficiaries as our filter for deciding the risk, rather than the financial impact on us as an organisation. So looking at this, we've seen how the risks might be applied in a table and how that might bring in the different factors, the likelihood, the impact. We might look at gross risk and net risk. It might be presented, for example, in a more graphical way as a heat map, where the risks that end up with a higher number as the final result are given different colours, and you might see the red risks up in one corner and the green risks down near where the axes join, and that would indicate that you'd focus on the things that were as far away from the bottom corner as possible. But just to recap, what we've looked at here is we've looked at how to identify the risks and how that happens in the organisation, the basic principles of how we assess risks, looked briefly at how we evaluate what action might be required. We didn't look very specifically at how we would monitor the risks, and I'll come on to that in just a second, but that is the final stage. So looking at how the trustees would be involved in all of this process, it may well be that there's a committee like a risk committee or an audit committee that engages with all the detail of risk registers and goes through the whole thing, and that the main board is only presented with a summary of the major risks once they've already been discerned. And actually for a board discussion, anything more than a handful of risks is probably difficult to engage with. And trustees then might choose to focus on individual risks, maybe at meetings bring in a particular risk owner, the person who's responsible for the area where the risk lies, and discuss with them how the risk was assessed, what progress they're making with actions that have been agreed, for example. Trustees also need to consider, and this is the monitoring point I was referring to, how they assure themselves that where they've identified managing or mitigating actions, that those are really being carried out and whether they're indeed effective. And that's a whole other day's topic. That's really to do with internal audit and internal assurance and whether you need that kind of thing. But trustee involvement would usually cover things like making sure that the assessment of risks is linked to the charity's objectives. And I mentioned at the beginning that linking your risk to your strategic objectives is often a really good way of structuring a register. Ensuring the process covers all of the areas of risk, so not just the financial risks or the really detailed ones that people on the committee might be specifically interested in. Ensuring it seeks to leave the charity with the right risk profile at the end of the day. This is what we often call risk appetite. So it's really the trustee's job to decide how much risk an organisation should be prepared to take. And that's a balance between not tying you up in knots and failing to achieve your objectives and the kind of things that might happen if things go wrong when they're unmanaged. Also, it includes covering all of the areas and making sure that the major risks are what the board really focuses on. And then finally, approving the summary of the risks and the actions that are being taken that's distilled into that commentary that you need to put in your trustees report that I mentioned as the requirement right at the beginning. So that's the end of the look at risks, and I'll move on to reserves, which as I've said is actually a really connected topic, and we've already seen that the impact of likely things that happen in the future on reserves is one of the biggest things we look at. But reserves is an area that first became a big issue for charities when in the 1990s, when it was sort of publicly criticised that some charities were much better at raising money than they were at actually spending it, and organisations like Guide Dogs for the Blind had managed to build up significant amounts of funds because they were pretty rapacious at their fundraising and simply couldn't train enough dogs to use it all. But recently the guidance has sort of changed slightly in focus. So all that early guidance was around not holding on to money and delaying spending it on the objectives you'd raised it for. Recent guidance is much more focused on building resilience in organisations, which I think most charity trustees would recognise as a bigger challenge for a lot of organisations. And the Charity Commission's got very specific guidance on this, CC19, Charity Reserves, and that sets out not just the overall framework for how charities should think about reserves, but also has some good examples in its appendices of specifically how trustees might go about constructing policies. And there's a good example for both a smaller and a larger charity. So before we get on to how we structure policies, what are reserves? So reserves are the part of a charity's income funds that are freely available to spend on any of the charity's purposes. And if we unpack that a little, what that means is it's not capital funds, it's not your endowments, it's not your restricted funds that are held for very specific purposes, and also doesn't include funds you've designated for specific purposes or funds that are held as fixed assets. So things like buildings, which you can't readily liquidate to use for other purposes. So why hold reserves? So there are various reasons why you might hold reserves, but in summary, they usually include things like risk management, specifically if your income's curtailed or you have unexpected expenditure. You might have some known contingencies, you might have litigation pending against you, you might have warranties on some of your products or whatever it might be. Working capital is a very important part of the reason for holding reserves, especially in charities that are funded in arrears for the work they do. They have to find the money to support their projects and then claim it back from someone else, and they need reserves to fund the gap in that. which we might describe as their trading cycle. And then there are seasonal or cyclical cash flows. So a lot of charities, say with membership schemes, would collect a lot of cash at the start of the year, but that would be more or less run down by the end of the year. And that's an important thing to consider, and we'll come back to it in looking at whether we set a point that we think reserves should be at, or whether we actually think about reserves as something a bit more dynamic. There are other strategic reasons why you might hold reserves. So you might be building up funds to save up to buy a building, for example, or some other kind of significant asset purchase, or to invest in new programs and new work. So the guidance in CC19 identifies a number of factors that you should consider. These are summarised as being the trustee should have a policy that fully justifies and explains why you are keeping reserves, if you are, or if you don't feel you need to keep reserves. And this might be charities that have a business model that's a bit like a supermarket, say, which is probably a bit flip, but where the cash is collected up front and then expenses are paid out later, you might feel you don't need to hold reserves. That identifies some plans for keeping your services going if things take a nasty turn. So for example, if your funding drops off, you've got enough money to keep your services going in an orderly way until you can pass your beneficiaries on to someone else to look after. That reflects the risks of unplanned closure. Now that is something where the Charity Commission and all the guidance is quite clear. That really is a bottom line reckoning. So you should at least have enough money around to close down in an orderly way if you needed to, but you definitely shouldn't use that as the total reserves. You think you might have all of those other positive reasons for keeping reserves are just as important. And then in amongst that, it's not just the actual costs of closing the organisation down, but would also include the costs of moving, as I've mentioned, services onto other people. So then CC19 talks a lot about what should be in the policy. As I mentioned right at the start of the presentation, both of these areas, risks and reserves, are actually governed by being pushed into the public arena by the Charity Commission and the SORP requiring disclosure. And CC19 says that charities should publish their reserves policy even if there isn't a legal requirement. And although CC19 is not legally binding, if ever a charity were being investigated and reviewed, I'm sure it would be something that would be taken account of. So just to look at some of those issues in why charities should hold reserves in a bit more detail, some of the areas where a bit of subtlety might be required. One area is, I said, restricted funds should be excluded from the calculation of reserves. And things, though, sometimes aren't quite as straightforward as that. So some charities receive funding that's quite broadly restricted. For example, they might have an appeal to fund their work in a particular continent, an Africa fund, say, for example. Or they might have money that's there from a specific donor, so often a government donor, that's there to fund programs that technically isn't available to fund head office costs, so it's slightly restricted, but is actually available to cover most conceivable costs. And assessing what reserves you need when you've got that kind of funding around is not always completely black and white. There may be assets in the charity. So a lot of charities that own their own property or have a big investment portfolio that's generating income would probably feel that their need for emergency funds was less because they could raise money against those assets if they needed to in that kind of contingency situation. As I've mentioned before, it might be that the business model of the charity means that that it's collecting cash before it needs to spend its money. So that might reduce the need for working capital. And then one area that's very often contentious when charities are constructing their reserves policies is this whole area of designated funds, which is very highly subjective. It's an area that the accounting standard setters don't really like because designated funds only really exist in the mind of the organisation. And sometimes charities have been guilty of designating funds because they know they don't count towards the reserves, when actually there's not massive substance to those designations. Some descriptions of designated funds you see actually overlap with the usual reasons for holding reserves, like a closure fund or an operational reserve. And for that reason, SORP requires charities to be very clear about why they've got designated funds, so what the intended use of the funds is and the likely timing of that expenditure. And when you're looking at reserves policies of other organisations, I think it's always important to look at the interaction between the reserves and the designated funds and make your own mind up whether the wordings really overlap a little. So just in terms of how we go about setting reserves policies, the methodologies, which, as I say, you can see in those appendices to CC19, they range from really, really sophisticated, pseudo-scientific kind of spreadsheet-driven things with lots of risk weightings and scenarios, to organisations which will just make a fairly broad brush assessment of a number of months of expenditure that they think they'd need to be able to fund to adjust the organisation in the event of of a problem. But the key thing to remember here, there's no real rules around this. There's not a benchmark for an acceptable level of reserves, even though some donors might sort of encourage you to think that there were acceptable levels. But it's down to the specific circumstances of the organisation and how you perceive the real needs for risks. But the key thing I'd probably say is that actually responding to perceived target levels by for donors or for fundraising, etc., is probably a dangerous path to go down, and equally flip-flopping and changing a reserves policy a lot to reflect the reserves you actually hold will also probably raise eyebrows as well. So when you're looking at setting reserves, I mentioned before that timing effects can be quite important. You might want to consider setting a range of reserves rather than a point of reserves, and that would be, for example, the very, very bottom line might be the winding up costs of the organisation, because that would be sort of, you would want morally to always have enough money to stand by your beneficiaries and your staff, etc., if you had to wind up. But the top end of your reserves policy might be the maximum amount you would allow reserves to rise to if you were preparing to invest in some new activity, for example, or really bluntly put, might be the most money you think you could have at hand and still look donors in the eye if you're asking for more. But the key thing is that it really should be a realistic assessment of what you need, and that you shouldn't write the policy around the balance that you're actually currently holding. So finally, I said I'd come back to the subject of going concern, and going concern is something that trustees have to think about every year when they sign off the accounts. Auditors are required to put a lot more work into considering going concern than maybe we were in the past. So it's a conversation that we're likely to be involved in with our clients every year. It's part of considering financial sustainability and partly driven by risk assessment. It isn't just an accounting exercise, but it is mainly done for accounting purposes. And the whole point around going concern is that it's an assessment of whether the charity should prepare the accounts on the assumption that it's going to carry on in business for the foreseeable future. And unless a charity is actually intending to wind down or will inevitably have to wind down, it should always prepare its accounts on a going concern basis. The key thing really that we're looking at is that underlying that, there are two stages to this process really. That first step, should the accounts be prepared on a going concern basis, as I've said, that's a very, very low hurdle. That's just simply a requirement unless you are inevitably going to wind up. But the second stage is much more important. It's whether there are material uncertainties around that going concern assumption. And this is the bit that auditors and trustees are expected to spend much more time thinking about these days. And that's very much linked to a risk assessment. So looking at things like whether your funding has got a cliff edge coming up in the next year or so, that if it doesn't renew would lead to very, very serious problems. Looking at the facilities you've got maybe to finance the organisation. But the level of risk involved in your business model really affects the amount of rigour and detail that's required in your going concern review. An organisation with an absolutely massive balance sheet that makes grants as it sees fit from its funds that are available would probably have no concern whatsoever about the going concern basis, whereas an organisation with one project that may or may not renew next year would have to consider very carefully what the probabilities were around that. Important parts of considering going concern are looking at stress testing, and that includes what we call reverse stress testing these days, which is where you look at what are the biggest changes the organisation could withstand, where we've identified that there are risks around whether we can continue in business. What are the biggest changes we could withstand, and are they at all likely to happen? And where an organisation identifies that there are risks that could quite plausibly lead to difficulties continuing in operation, we then move in to a situation where disclosures are required. It may be that when we look at the probabilities of things happening, we either decide that the probability is very low, that the difficulties will occur, or that we've got the capacity to respond in pretty realistic ways to minimise the impact of that. And this again feeds off our risk analysis and the mitigations we might have in there. So we might have the ability to switch off most of our expenditure if the project funding dries up, for example, or dip into our reserves if we've got significant reserves. If we do identify material uncertainty, we have to flag that in the accounts, and we have to say to the outside world so that they understand before dealing with their organisation that there are issues that could lead to problems with going concern. We give a fair view of how we're dealing with those and why we believe it's still right and proper for us to carry on. And also it may involve some reporting by the auditors. So as auditors, we're responsible for highlighting in our report if those material uncertainties exist as well. So that was just a very brief sort of look at going concern, which really interacts, as I said, with both of those areas of risk management and reserves policies, because you'll look to both of those in deciding whether there is an issue at all with going concern. So just to conclude, we've looked at risk management and we've looked at reserves, and the risk management policy often is informed by the level of reserves you've got. The level of risk you can afford to take will depend on that, and reserves policies, as I said right at the start, are often driven by your risk assessment. That then flows through into your going concern assessment and your financial review at the end of the year. But the key thing to remember about all of these things is they're not just about compliance. I said at the start that they're brought out into the open by being required in the Charities SORP. There's a risk that people see this as something the auditor and the finance director are nagging them to do, but they're really all about making sure your charity can meet its strategic objectives and continue into the future. And that's the conclusion of this session on risk and reserves.